Do you remember your high school yearbook photo? Think back to it. Envision it. What do you notice? Was your hair not quite right? Or did you just get a fresh cut that day? Do you recognize the image staring back at you? Now, I want to tell you about a 17-year-old named Danny. When he was starting to go through puberty, he looked into the mirror and he didn't recognize what he saw. He would turn to the side and he would see breasts and he would press them down. That's not me in the mirror, he thought to himself. Sophomore year of high school, he cut his hair really short and he looked into the mirror and he smiled. That's when it felt right. Now, at age 17, Danny uses male pronouns and often feels like a boy, but not always. One thing he knows is that he never feels like a girl, the sex he was assigned at birth. Danny identifies as gender non-binary. He's attracted to boys, calls himself gay. The labels don't necessarily work great for Danny, but he's getting by. He's learning about new ones every day, especially online. He's learning about labels like pansexual, attracted to people regardless of their gender identity or biological sex. He's learning about labels like asexual, experiencing little to no sexual desire. He's learning about labels like polyamorous, open to multiple relationships simultaneously. Now, Danny doesn't live in Santa Cruz, and he doesn't live in San Francisco or Chicago or some other place known for being supportive, if not progressive, when it comes to gender and sexual diversity. No. Danny lives in a small town in California's Central Valley. And his friends don't necessarily get it. They say, if you were born a girl and you like guys, doesn't that basically make you straight? No way, says Danny. Danny is part of a new generation, leading a revolution in how we think about gender and sexuality. Young people are using entirely new and expansive vocabulary to describe their gender and sexual desire. We scientists are playing catch-up. When I started a project 5 years ago to study the lives of today's queer teenagers, I thought I had a clue. I'm a 43-year-old gay guy. I came out when I was 17, and I've basically been immersed in queer communities my entire life. But I didn't know what I was in for. You see, I was a child of the 1980s, a teenager of the 1990s, the product of 20th century binary thinking, the product of a pre-digital age. The young people I've worked with were born at the start of this century. They grew up with the marriage equality movement. They had a front row seat to the winds of change as public opinion flipped to support marriage equality by the time they were in high school. And marriage equality became the law of the land. They saw transgender visibility rise dramatically. And with that, a new vocabulary emerged. Google started to see huge spikes in searches for the word cisgender, which describes those whose gender identity matches their sex assigned at birth. And something else happened at the beginning of this century that made the childhoods of young people like Danny very unusual. Danny was 11 when Instagram was launched. He was only 8 at the birth of Twitter and Tumblr. Danny and his friends grew up on social media. They're the first generation to know no limits when it comes to access to information and possibilities for human connection. Danny's story is a 21st century story. The 21st century is the era of radical authenticity. It's a time of alignment between our inner experience of gender and sexuality and our external expression of it. It's a time of revolution and possibilities for authentic self-expression. It's a time of revolution, but it's not affecting everyone equally. Some are being left behind. A pattern emerged in my research with queer teenagers. It turns out the vast majority of young people who feel emboldened to be radically authentic in their gender and sexuality have been, like Danny, assigned female at birth. What's going on with boys? Well, it turns out some things have changed from when I was in high school in the 1990s, and some things haven't. The boys in my study, they talked about the pressures to be one of the guys, to be tough, to be athletic, to be straight. They talked about fearing violence if they were seen as too feminine. They talked about name-calling. Listening to boys, I realized the revolution isn't over, it's underway. Authenticity is constrained by the legacies of gender and sexuality that we inherit. Young people are not starting from scratch, they are working from templates. And it turns out the template for boys just hasn't gone through a complete redesign yet. Our ability to practice authenticity is tangled up in understandings of gender and sexuality from the past, but that isn't stopping young people from doing it. The stories of young people like Danny give me hope. But guess what? This revolution is not just for young people like Danny. It's for all of us. Across the life course, more people are finding the words to describe their gender and sexuality authentically. They're coming out as transgender in their 90s, asexual in their 50s, kinky and polyamorous in their 40s. The revolution is trickling up. Young people like Danny are leading the revolution, but we're all a part of it. We're all participating in the movement away from binary thinking, opening up the space for radical authenticity. When I think back to my high school portrait, I'm not sure I actually recognize what I see. That smile hides so much of what I know I was feeling at the time. But I never could have imagined the optimism I would now feel, privileged to hear the stories of young people like Danny, feeling liberated to express my own brand of authenticity, liberated from the constraints of another time, living in the era of radical authenticity. Thank you.